Welcome to another deep dive, listeners. This time we're headed to the South Pacific, to the island nation of Vanuatu.
Beautiful place.
Yeah, incredible history too.
Mm.
And we've got some really fascinating sources to dig into for this one. We're going to be looking at excerpts from Wikipedia's History of Vanuatu page.
Mm-hmm.
And also the Vanuatu Tourism Office's website has a great page on history that we'll be pulling from. So picture this. Vanuatu, a small island nation with, get this, 113 distinct languages.
Oh.
I know, right? And a cultural history that goes back thousands of years. That's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it really speaks to the incredible diversity of the region. You've
Right.
got Melanesian influences, Polynesian influences, all kind of blending together over centuries.
It's a real melting pot. And you know what else is really interesting?
What's that?
The story of Chief Roy Mata. Have you heard of him?
Oh, yeah. He's legendary. This powerful chief who united warring tribes way back in ancient times.
Yeah, like something out of a myth.
Right, and his death and burial on Rotoka Island are actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site now.
So it's not just a story. They actually found his burial site. Archaeologists have uncovered skeletons there that date back to the time period described in the oral accounts.
It's amazing how those oral histories were passed down through generations and how they actually line up with the archaeological evidence.
It really brings those ancient stories to life.
Okay.
So you've got this rich ancient history happening, and then boom, European explorers arrive on the scene.
Yeah, and as you can imagine, things changed quite a bit after that.
Yeah, in 1606, the Portuguese explorer Pedro Fernandes de Quiros lands on Espiritu Santo. He thinks he's found part of Terra Australis.
Terra Australis.
Yeah, that mythical southern continent that Europeans were obsessed with finding.
Right.
So talk about a case of mistaken identity.
It really shows you how driven those early explorers were by these grand ideas, even if those were a little bit off sometimes.
Totally. And of course, once they found Vanuatu, things were never the same. Captain Cook sails through in 1774, names the islands New Hebrides.
And that name stuck around for a while.
It did. Almost 100 years. And unfortunately, with the arrival of Europeans, also came a wave of exploitation. Like when sandalwood was discovered on Erromango in 1825.
Oh, yeah, that led to a lot of conflict, unfortunately, between the indigenous Melanesians and the Polynesian workers that were brought in to harvest the wood.
It's a sad but familiar story, isn't it? This pattern of exploitation that seemed to follow European colonialism wherever it went. And then, of course, there was blackbirding.
Oh, yeah, blackbirding was essentially a system of forced labor.
Right. From the 1860s onward, people from Vanuatu were tricked or coerced into working on plantations in Australia, Fiji, New Caledonia.
Terrible conditions. Imagine, on some islands, more than half the adult male population was taken away to work in these awful conditions.
It's heartbreaking. It tore apart families, disrupted communities, and had long-lasting consequences for Vanuatu. And then at the same time, you have missionaries arriving, trying to convert the Ni Vanuatu people to Christianity.
Yeah, the missionaries brought education and healthcare, which was positive, but they also actively worked to dismantle traditional beliefs and practices.
So it's kind of a mixed bag, their impact.
Right, definitely. A complex legacy.
So you've got this mix of indigenous people, laborers from other islands, missionaries, and then you start to see European settlers arriving as well, looking to establish plantations.
Mainly for coconuts.
Right. And you can imagine how this all starts to create some tension, a real power struggle brewing.
Yeah. And that's where we see the seeds of the colonial system that would come to define Vanuatu for almost a century.
Yeah. The arrival of those European settlers and the plantations really changed the power dynamic in a way that had long-lasting consequences for the Ni Vanuatu people.
Absolutely. And it all culminated in this very strange system of government, the Anglo-French condominium. It was established in 1906.
The condominium. Two separate governments, British and French, operating side by side, but rarely cooperating.
Yeah. Talk about a recipe for confusion. Imagine having to navigate two sets of laws, two police forces, two currencies. It was a bureaucratic nightmare.
I bet. What was it like for the Ni Vanuatu, caught in the middle of this colonial tug of war?
It must have been incredibly challenging, but it also speaks to their resilience,
Right.
constantly having to adapt to forces beyond their control.
Yeah. Just when you think things can't get any more complicated, World War II rolls around. It adds a whole other layer to this already complex history.
Right. Suddenly, Vanuatu becomes strategically important for the Allied forces, And thousands of U.S. troops arrive on Espiritu Santo, bringing with them modern technology and infrastructure.
Yeah. The American presence in Vanuatu during the war is a fascinating story in itself, like the story of Million Dollar Point. Have you heard of that?
Oh, yeah. Instead of taking all their surplus equipment back with them at the end of the war, the Americans just bulldozed it all into the sea.
Can you imagine? Divers today can go explore this underwater graveyard of jeeps and bulldozers and all sorts of war machinery.
It's like a sunken museum, a really strange and unexpected sight.
It is. It really makes you think about the scale of the American presence there.
Yeah.
And then there's the story of the SS President Coolidge, luxury liner turned troop transport that sank in Santo Harbor.
Hit a mine, right?
Yeah. And now it's one of the world's most famous dive wrecks.
Amazing how this luxury liner went from carrying wealthy passengers to transporting soldiers to becoming a home for all sorts of marine life. It's like a time capsule, frozen in time beneath the waves.
It really is. But the end of the war also marked the beginning of a new chapter for Vanuatu.
The road to independence. A road that would be paved with, well, a few more bumps along the way.
Yeah, bumps for sure.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest ones was this whole issue of land ownership.
Ah, yeah. Land is always a tricky subject, especially when you've got different cultures with different ideas about what land means.
Right. For the Niai Vanuatu, land wasn't just property. It was deeply tied to their identity, their culture, something held in trust for future generations, something sacred almost. So you can imagine how that created some tension with the European settlers who had a very different view of land, right?
Totally. They saw it as a commodity, something to be bought, sold, exploited for profit.
Yeah. That clash of perspectives is never going to be easy to resolve. And by the 1960s, those European settlers actually owned a significant chunk of Vanuatu's land.
Yeah, about 30%, mostly used for those coconut plantations we were talking about earlier. And when the planters started clearing even more land for cattle production, well, that's when things really started to
Protests started happening, right?
Exactly. Especially on the islands of Santo and Molecula, people were fed up with seeing their land taken away from them. And it was around this time that the movement for independence really started to gain momentum.
Okay. So enter Jimmy Stevens and his Nagrium Mill movement advocating for indigenous land rights and a return to custom.
Right. Custom, the traditional Melanesian way of life, it became kind of a rallying cry for reclaiming their cultural heritage and pushing back against all these outside influences.
So custom was about more than just land rights. It was about reclaiming their identity.
Exactly. Their connection to the land, their ancestors, their traditional ways of life. And at the same time, you also had political parties forming, pushing for full independence from the condominium.
Okay, and that's where Father Walter Leaney comes in, right?
Yes. Father Walter Leaney, an Anglican priest, formed the Vanuatu Party in 1974. And they were really at the forefront of the push for independence.
Wow, so you've got Stevens advocating for custom, Leaney pushing for full independence, and the colonial powers, Britain and France, kind of stuck in the middle of all this. What happens next?
Well, in 1979, a date is set for Vanuatu's independence.
Finally.
But not everyone is happy about it, least of all the French.
Oh, why is that?
Well, they feared losing their influence in the region, understandably. And what's really interesting here is the way the French kind of played both sides.
What do you mean?
Publicly, they supported Vanuatu's independence, but secretly, they were fueling rebellions on the islands of Tena and Espiritu Santo.
No way. So they were trying to undermine the independence movement while pretending to support it.
Yep, pretty sneaky, huh? And they particularly encouraged the rebellion led by Jimmy Stevens on Santo. There's even evidence that they encouraged Stevens to declare Espiritu Santo an independent state.
Wow. Talk about a double game.
Yeah, it was a pretty cynical move. And it led to what became known as the Coconut War. This rather strange and ultimately tragic conflict on Espiritu Santo.
Okay, the Coconut War.
Oh.
Gotta hear more about that.
So picture this. June 1980. Stevens and his followers on Santo, they blockade the airport, they destroy bridges, and they declare independence, calling their new state Vemerana.
And they did all this armed with bows and arrows, right?
Yeah. Bows and arrows, rocks, slingshots. Not exactly what you'd picture in a war.
It sounds more like something out of a movie.
It does, doesn't it? And the newly formed Vanuatu government, they had to request help from Papua New Guinea to put down the rebellion.
Why Papua New?
Because Britain and France weren't exactly stepping up to help. They'd kind of created this mess, but they weren't too keen on cleaning it up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So Papua New Guinean troops arrive on Santo, and there are a few skirmishes, but nothing too serious. But then tragedy strikes. Stevens's son is killed when his vehicle runs through a Papua New Guinean roadblock.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it's a really sad turn of events. And shortly after that, Stevens surrenders. And during his trial, it was revealed that he'd been receiving support not only from the French government, but also from an American business foundation called the Phoenix Foundation.
An American foundation. What were they doing getting involved in all this?
Well, it turns out they had plans to establish a libertarian tax haven in Vanuatu.
So money was at the root of it, as usual.
Seems like it. Stevens was sentenced to 14 years in prison. And despite all this turmoil, Vanuatu finally achieved independence on July 30th, 1980, with Father Walter Leaney as its first prime minister.
It's amazing that after all that colonial meddling, the forced labor, the rebellions, Vanuatu was still able to become an independent nation.
It is. It really speaks to the resilience and determination of the Ni Vanuatu people. They never gave up on their fight for self-determination. And their story is both fascinating and inspiring.
Yeah, it is. Full of twists and turns, for sure. But I imagine things didn't magically become perfect once they achieved independence.
Right. Of course not. They've faced ongoing challenges, political instability, economic struggles, the effects of climate change. But through it all, they've managed to hold on to their unique cultural heritage, their custom.
Right. That connection to their culture, their land, their past, it's what's helped them through so much. And it brings us back to Chief Roy Mata. Even after centuries of outside influence, his story still resonates, doesn't it?
It does. His legacy, along with the turbulent history of colonialism, war, and independence, just reminds us that Vanuatu is a place where the past is always present, informing and shaping the lives of its people.
It really is a remarkable place, with a rich and complex history. And as we learn more about it, it makes you wonder what lessons we can take away from Vanuatu's journey. What stands out to you?
Well, for me, it's that resilience you were talking about, the resilience of the Ni Vanuatu people. I mean, they face so much exploitation, forced labor, colonial rule, but they never gave up on that fight for independence, that self-determination.
Yeah, and it makes you realize that even in the face of incredible adversity, people can overcome these huge challenges and shape their own destiny. And I think for Vanuatu, a big part of that resilience comes from that strong connection to their culture and to their land.
Right, that sense of identity,
Yeah.
of knowing where they come from. It must have helped them persevere through so much, and it makes their story all the more remarkable.
It does, and it highlights the importance of really understanding the long-term impact of colonialism. I mean, the effects are still felt today, not just in Vanuatu, but in countries all over the world. That's a really good point. It's a reminder that history isn't just something that happened in the past. It shapes the present in so many ways. And speaking of things that shape the present, we can't forget about that incredible linguistic diversity in Vanuatu. I mean, 113 distinct languages
It's mind-boggling.
in such a relatively small population, too. How do people even navigate that in their daily lives?
I know. It makes you think. Imagine going to the market and having to figure out which language to use with each vendor.
It really speaks to their adaptability, their cultural fluency.
Totally. And it also challenges our own assumptions about language and communication. You know, we tend to think of countries as having one dominant language, but Vanuatu shows us that diversity can be a source of strength, a source of
Yeah.
resilience.
Yeah. And honestly, it makes you realize how much richer our understanding of the world would be if we were all exposed to more linguistic and cultural diversity.
Absolutely. Broadens our perspective, helps us see the world through these different lenses.
So I guess as we wrap up our deep dive into Vanuatu's history, I'm just left with this sense of awe for this small island nation that's faced so much, but still holds on to its unique culture and traditions.
Yeah. It's a reminder that there are so many fascinating stories out there, hidden in these corners of the world, just waiting to be discovered.
Well said. And maybe it inspires us to learn a little bit of Bislama, Vanuatu's official language. What do you think?
Oh, now that would be an adventure.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Vanuatu's past. We hope you learned something new and maybe even been inspired by the stories we've shared. Until next time, keep exploring.